For me, James always carried the archetype of the radical fairy for me. That was the archetype. While Harry Hay and I spent a lot of time organizing the first gathering and continuing keeping things going, and many other people look upon Harry Hay as the archetype of the radical fairy. I always saw James as that person. Self-effacing, going about his work in the village, doing what he had to do, sharing his beauty and creativity with other people, not being too hung up on positive reviews, although that's always nice to get. Being able to dance in the moonlight. I always had the feeling with Harry that he would be a little bit too uptight, like I would be, of taking off my clothing and dancing in the moonlight. I think with James, that would not have been a problem. So when I think of the archetype of the radical fairy externally, James Broughton is a person I always go to. There's something pixie-ish about it. There's something that, in Ireland they have there's a warning that parents have, are told about. They said you have to be careful about watching your children at night, because if they hear the fairy music, they'll want to crawl out the window and go and be with the fairies and dance in the moonlight with them, sing with them, and you might not get them back. James always seemed like that kind of subversive fairy. He was the person that once you danced with him, or once you heard the music, it was hard to go back to mommy and daddy's house again. He was revolutionary, actually, in the way that he moved in the world. Not in the terms of the manifestos he issued, but more in the way that he lived his life and the way that he provided a model for us as gay men to maybe consider as a path that's worth walking. It's hard for me to describe somebody else's journey. What I generally do is I love listening to people talking about their journey. I think the big turning point for him was separating from Pauline Kael, from his wife. That separation was the turning point for him. And many times, in a broader context, an important turning point in all of our lives, and I thank Carl Jung for this understanding, is at midlife, is at age 40 symbolically. However you define midlife, and it's not necessarily chronological, where all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, gradually, but where there comes a time when the price you pay for living an inauthentic life, the price you pay for living a life of the false self, giving to the world a persona that's not real. There comes a time when you have to take off the mask. Malcolm Boyd wrote one of his books about his coming out was Take Off the Mask. It's that idea that someplace the price we pay for living that life is too high. It's destroying us. And in many different ways, we free ourselves from that prison. And I think that was a major creative turning point for James that allowed him to go deeper in terms of listening to himself. Earlier, I used the word inner authority. I think up until that time, from things that he's told me and things that I've read about James, he was a good boy. Maybe mom is a good boy. And external authority was important in his life. And there came a point where he was no longer willing to pay that price. And he ended a marriage. He moved in a different direction. And I think it's like his life being spared, like somebody absolving him of something or pardoning him or something, and allowed him to live his life again. And whenever you have a near-death experience, and that's what those lives in the closet are, near-death experiences, every time you have that, and you realize you're not going to die, there's an energy that flows through you that this time I'm going to use it much better. And I think James's life is a good example of that. I'm not trying to imply that before this turning point in his life, he wasn't creative, because he was. He was creative as a 6-year-old. You couldn't take that out of him. But in terms of deepening his journey, deepening his creativity, listening to voices maybe that he hadn't listened to before internally. That happened after he left the marriage, found Joel, and life unfolded in a different direction. Well, I always move from the place that death ends a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. So it doesn't feel to me as if I've lost James. I'll pick up his poetry. I'll be talking to somebody and I'll say, oh, wait a minute. James Broughton wrote a poem about this. And I go scurrying through my books, opening up. Oh, here it is. You got it? So it's not like he's not here. James has moved from elder to ancestor. And in that ancestral role, it isn't as if the ancestors aren't here with us. They are here with us, sometimes on a daily basis. And when we need them, when we need to access their wisdom, they're available to us. So the idea of death, he's gone from me, it doesn't compute for me. I still have an alive relationship with him. For example, I have a more alive relationship with my father since my 40s than I ever had with him while he was here on this plane. The discussions I had with him, the understandings that I get, the remembrances of things that he said to me at certain points are more alive today than when I was 16. Tidings to Stan Brakhage, written in 1965. Where were you in 1965? I asked the sea, it's called. I asked the sea how deep things are. Oh, said she, that depends about how far you want to go. Well, I have a sea in me, said I. Do you have a me in you? Oh, here we go. I'll look, said the sea, but that's apt to go rather deep. And she broke a wave over my foot. Why are you so restless? Said I to the sea. I'm calmer than you, said she. This sounds like something out of Alice in Wonderland. The wind and the moon like to toss me about by myself. I do nothing at all. I accept whatever comes, and everything comes to me. How do you manage that, said I. Well, that's a good question. And she replied, oh, she replied, I have rather a good digestion. The whimsy in him, the playfulness in him, the fairy in him is truly a delight whenever I read his stuff. One of the lines of poetry that I read in one of his poems, this might have been, who knows when, Mark Thompson was in the habit of when a new book would come out by James, he would buy a copy for me and slip it unannounced into my lunch bag to feed me during my lunch break, both literally and spiritually. But some decades ago, who knows when, I read a line of James's where he said, I live my life by the great cliches. That caught my attention. Because, as an uppity 18, 19-year-old in college, I always made fun and put down people who spoke in platitudes, cliches, what have you, like our presidents. And all of a sudden, I live my life by the great cliches. What did he mean by that? Was he being funny? So kind of like John Cage writing one of his symphonies, a new movement every 10 years. I kind of, maybe 10 years or so, contemplated that. Every now and then I think, I wonder what he means by that. Oh, he's just being funny, James. He's making... And then by the second decade, I began thinking, I don't, maybe he's not making fun. Maybe he's really serious. And as I got older, I began to understand, at least for myself, that when you don't understand you're talking in cliches, there's a problem. Because you're not saying anything. But when you know about cliches, when you see how cliches are used, you don't want to imitate that. But in every cliche, in every platitude, in every aphorism, there is a kernel of deep wisdom if you pay attention to it. And I think that's what James was talking about like with the sea going deep. He was kind of like, I don't know, E.E. Cummings. He was beyond punctuation and capital letters. Not because he didn't know how to do it, but that wasn't what he was doing. And the same with James. It was like those cliches really did guide his life, but not in the way they guided most people. He understood the wisdom many times contained in them. It's kind of, most people deal with the outer shell of the fortune cookie. James had, metaphorically, the courage and wisdom to break it open and actually read what was inside. And so his poetry obviously speaks to me. The way Whitman's poetry speaks to me. The way Ginsberg's poetry speaks to me. In many ways, he was as visionary as they were. But where Whitman alludes to the pleasures of the flesh, and sometimes makes us believe that he was getting it, and there's some debate about whether it was imaginary or real, but it doesn't really matter. James was somebody who lived it. I see him in that tradition of Blake, Whitman, Ginsberg, the visionary tradition that gay men are often found a part of. If they were present, I never heard them. People knew better than to share them with me. No, I never heard them. I think mostly I would hear James's poetry read in circles of gay men. Either he would be doing a reading at Different Light bookstore here in Los Angeles, or he would be doing a reading at some fairy event. And I think it was using Harry's metaphor of subject-subject consciousness. I think it was a subject-subject consciousness experience where it was same listening to the same and got it. That's an interesting question. I would wonder how straight people would react to that poetry. We know from Blake and Whitman and Ginsberg that straight men, straight women, I react to it many times in the same way we do, or in ways that also move them. I was, when is this, maybe 1969, 70? I was at a bunch of us from the Gay Liberation Front here in Los Angeles. I drove up to Sacramento where Ginsberg was giving a poetry reading. The gym was packed. It was literally standing room only. And there was Alan sitting in the middle on a little blanket with his harmonium, just Alan and his harmonium, singing his poetry. And at one point he said, "I need a male volunteer to help me with this next poem." And hands went up, and Alan picked the cutest, youngest gay man that I don't know if he's gay or not. And he came, and Alan said, "I'd like you to sit in front of me so I can keep you in my gaze." And then he read his poem, "Fuck Me," which consists of the words, "fuck me." But as Alan said it, it wasn't just "fuck me" over and over again. Each one of those times he said it had a different intonation. It was a different place in the dance that Alan was speaking from. I would speculate that that was a young straight man sitting in front of him. He handled it beautifully, and when it was over, he went over and kissed Alan on the cheek. There is some place where I think this gay visionary poetry is heard by a much larger audience. And I would include James in that. That's pretty much how he was moving in the world. There comes a time, and I'm 70 right now, and so I'm an old man right now, but there came a time in my life, and it wasn't as I hoped in my 20s, or 30s, or 40s, but sometime after 50, there came a time when, the issues around mommy and daddy just weren't important anymore. They did not occupy. The issues around that I'm gay or not, the issue that I come from a working class family, the issue of privileged people and their privilege, and blah, blah. And there came a point where I felt, and I'm still feeling, a peacefulness. I would say for me, it's the great contentment. For James, it was the great joy. But I think we're probably sitting next to each other in the forest, that those patches are close to each other. There comes a time as an old person where much of this material does integrate, where much of the alchemical process does produce a version of, more than a 99-cent store version of the Philosopher's Stone. And when hearing that statement around James, I think it's true for him. That there's some place where he moved in the world with joy.
I'm a